Hello everyone, Miklos Vespremi here, coming to you from Olbia, Italy. Now, for those of you that saw my last video, you were probably expecting me to be talking about the one thing that I claim that every productivity advice provider forgets to mention. Since then, I ran an explainer about carbon credits on LinkedIn, in which I promised to make this video in case the post reached 50 likes and 3 shares. As of now, it has about 120 likes and 20 shares, so I better get on with this video. But rest assured, the productivity episode has been made and will be released soon. Now, let me preface this discussion with a short disclaimer. The carbon credit market is extremely complex. It is challenging even to just explain how it works today, let alone predicting how it will develop in the future. I'm not a carbon credit project developer, but rather simply a sustainability consultant that is curious and that has been following the space for some time. What I'm doing here is simply laying out my understanding of the market in the hopes that this might be useful to you and accelerate a conversation that we need to be having about this pivotal technology in the fight against climate change. Because I must say, I'm not entirely satisfied with the material that is out there. There's a lot of excellent reports on the future development of the carbon credits market, particularly one from EY's Net Zero Center. But when it comes to future price developments, many of these reports consistently fail to seriously factor in the political dimension, which in my opinion has the very real potential to become an instant knockout punch to the entire market. Furthermore, I have not yet found a report that seriously tackles the challenge of explaining the interaction between the two sides of the market, so the compliance and the voluntary sides. And I must say that that might be a shortcoming of my take as well. So please use this as a provocation to continue the conversation and bear with me as I am learning as well. That said, I do have a lot to say about it, so let's dive straight in. I'm going to structure my discussion in 4 chapters. First, what carbon credits are and comparing the various types. Secondly, some thoughts about the role that they play in fighting climate change. Third, current bottlenecks that are preventing it from scaling. And fourth, rather than give a future prediction as such, I would like to guide you through some of the incentives that I see playing a role in the market's development. And since there's a lot to explore, this video will probably just address the first point. The rest will be in the next video I release. So let's start with carbon credits. What are carbon credits? So a carbon credit is a piece of paper that certifies that a ton of carbon has been sequestered somewhere. It of course tells you where, under what conditions, and with what additional benefits it occurred. Now, this piece of paper can be traded, it can be stored for the future, or so-called retired, which for all practical purposes means you burn it. If it is on the blockchain, it is sent to a terminal unreachable address, or if not, it is stored on a registry for retired credits. You can no longer use it, but you then can feel entitled to credit the carbon reduction to your organization's emissions balance, whether that is a corporation or a country. But let me make very clear that through all these transactions, nothing ever happened to the underlying asset that sequestered the ton of carbon in the first place. So the two pieces are somewhat independent. So more importantly, the way that the current process works, if that underlying asset suffered any damage and the carbon is no longer sequestered to the extent promised, nothing or very little happens to that piece of paper called the carbon credit. But what are these underlying assets and why are they such a risk? So, as I did in the LinkedIn post, I'd like to break down the various types of assets across 2 dimensions. So you have on one side nature versus technology-based assets, and on the other side you have avoidance versus removal. Now, what does that all mean? To begin with, nature-based carbon credits. Nature-based carbon credits represent the carbon sequestration of a natural asset. So forests, swamps, agriculture, etc. Technology-based is anything that uses some sort of man-made machine or device to do so. There are a few rare cases that are ambiguous, such as BECCS, which stands for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which involves growing some energy-dense crop, burning it, and finally capturing and sequestering that carbon through technological interventions. So you see something between the two. On the other side, or axis, excuse me, you have avoidance, which means setting a baseline, a business as usual scenario of carbon emissions, and then projecting how much the assets that you're investing in are expected to lower the emissions associated. Removal, by contrast, involves in some form actually sucking the carbon out of the air and making it disappear more or less permanently. So I'd like to spend the rest of the video giving some examples of each type. So let's start with a prototypical carbon sequestration asset. Trees. So if you plant a tree where before there was none, you've effectively removed some carbon from the atmosphere. So nature-based removal. As a very, very rough guide, a very simplified guide, an average tree might sequester about 1 ton of carbon across its lifetime. Now, just note that this might vary between not sequestering anything at all and actually being carbon positive to sequestering 20 times that with particularly old and sturdy trees. Also, ever heard of the time value of money? So $1 today is not worth the same as $1 tomorrow. So obviously the same principle applies to carbon sequestration. While a forest is growing, it often will be a net emitter of carbon before transitioning to sequestration over time. But given the urgency of the climate crisis, this is a problem. So next time you think you're doing good by planting a tree, think again. Now, you probably are doing good, but probably not now, and probably not fast enough. Flying, for example, emits carbon now. Flying from Europe to the East Coast in economy class is about 2 tons of CO2. If you eventually mop up those emissions by planting 2 trees that cover that over the course of the next 40 years might sequester 2 tons of carbon, in my opinion, you've not done much about your emissions. Other types of nature-based removal include regenerative agriculture, which enriches the soil with soil organic carbon, or restoring wetlands, which tends to sequester far more carbon than intensely farmed pastures, planting mangroves, and in general, reversing what we've done to what we call nature from its natural state. Let's continue with nature-based avoidance. Now, nature-based avoidance involves looking at a forest or some other natural assets like the ones I just mentioned and making some assumptions about how likely it is that they will be logged or burned down. So if you can prevent that from happening, for example, by setting in place some protection measures or buying up a piece of forest that was meant for destruction, you are in effect reducing the amount of carbon that would have entered the atmosphere had you done nothing. So the challenge here is threefold. First of all, it is extremely difficult to accurately gauge how much carbon is in a complex ecosystem to begin with. So remember that it's not just the weight of the tree and the foliage that you have to consider, but all the life above ground that the presence of that vegetation makes possible. As well as, probably the most important, all the roots underneath the ground and all the carbon sequestration that is happening in the earth, especially through fungal networks. Now, secondly, how likely it is that the destruction was going to happen. And thirdly, by how much the said intervention that you paid for lowered that likelihood. And we're not even talking about the time factor in all of this that I mentioned earlier. A major factor here as well is so-called leakage. And that's basically, what if you protect a forest, but the community around it needed the wood, so they're going to do something about it anyway. And if you protect this forest, they'll just go to that forest and log that instead. So the net effect is actually worse than nothing, because not only are they logging the forest that they would have logged anyway, but they actually have a little bit extra cash to do it faster thanks to the carbon credit sales. So I've actually heard of examples in some tropical forests in which a bunch of wood is logged illegally, nice tropical wood. Then, once there's not much there left, maybe some charred something, they plant a bunch of palm oil plants there and degrade the land even more. Now, once not even that works, the few bits of grass that still dare to grow on that ground are used to feed cattle for beef. When even cattle can't manage with this depleted ground, the only tree that can still survive on that sort of ground is planted, eucalyptus, which is non-native in most parts of the world and kills everything around it. But then, a smart trick, carbon credits are sold for those eucalyptus trees because you've just been reforesting, haven't you? And we call this nature restoration, after money has been made on nature's back 4 times, leaving the soil utterly cursed. Anyway, let's continue with tech-based avoidance. So, the prototypical example of tech-based avoidance is financing cook stoves. So, if you assume that a population is cutting down trees for the wood to make fires to cook with, if you were to get them to use cook stoves instead, using methane, for example, you have effectively reduced the pressure on the natural environment and lowered the CO2 emissions associated with them. The credits that are usually created through tech-based avoidance are renewable energy, however. So, again, if you assume that a coal power plant is going to be built, but with a little bit of extra cash provided by some carbon credits, you could get the developer to build a solar power plant instead. Well, then you could say that compared to the business as usual scenario, you've effectively lowered the emissions. Again, here there is another challenge, which is that often renewable energy like solar tends to be the cheapest anyway. So in many cases, the project developer was going to do some renewable energy anyway, or was strongly tending to it. So there's no additionality. Additionality being the concept of whether the intervention actually made a difference that would have not happened by itself. Other examples of tech-based avoidance include upgrading electricity systems to smart grids, but also electric vehicles or CCS, as mentioned. Theoretically, there are many things that go. Now let's get to the last type of credit, which is technology-based removal. Now, the best known example, at least to me, is direct air capture, DAC, a process by which air is forced through a membrane with solvents that chemically bind the CO2 in the air. Then those solvents, those membranes, are heated up, and all that CO2 that has been chemically bound dissipates and can be captured. Now, you don't literally capture it in a bottle, but you can imagine the output being literally a bottle of CO2. And my point is just that there's no denying that you have captured the CO2. Unlike most of these other methods where you have to do some complicated math to come up with some numbers. Now, in practice, of course, what does happen is that CO2 that is captured is driven deep into the ground, several kilometers, into usually limestone formations, and eventually, over some time, that CO2 becomes rock itself, which, of course, doesn't harm anybody to have a little bit more limestone a few kilometers underground. There is a little bit of a risk that it comes up, but that risk in practice is almost zero. The risk is comparable to the risk of a nuclear power plant experiencing a complete meltdown. And I'm talking about a new modern nuclear power plant. Now, for those that are following me, you will know or will find out that I have very strong opinions about nuclear energy. But suffice it to say, in both cases, the risk is virtually zero. Now, other examples for tech-based removal credits include enhanced weathering, very attractive technology, carbon mineralization in concrete, algal synfuels with carbon capture and storage, but there are many other even more outlandish techniques that might qualify and are qualifying already. Now, to finish, let's just talk about some of these credits and how they compare. So, starting with permanence, which is the technical term for how long the CO2 remains captured. As my preceding comments suggest, the by far safest option is tech-based removal. Next is probably nature-based removal, which, with all the provisos mentioned beforehand, followed with avoidance. Although I would say that nature-based avoidance is probably better than tech-based avoidance, just because of the knotty problem of additionality, in which increasingly it's unclear whether it's actually making an effect. Just fun fact in between. Before carbon credits really were a thing, the modern type of carbon credits, we had the clean development mechanism. And China was actually the largest receiver of clean development mechanism credits. And yet China has grown their emissions enormously. Well, that is just to show that sometimes they can't really have much of an effect because of this problem of additionality and leakage. Let's continue with price. So with price, the clear winners are everything apart from tech-based removal. So not direct air capture, because those are very, very big and expensive machines. There are huge variations in quality of the projects and the credits that they create. I'm talking about everything but tech-based removal, with a low end in the single-digit dollar amount per ton of CO2 to the high end in double digits. Direct air capture, however, is retailing at high 3-digit or even 4-digit numbers, which is 10 to 100 times more expensive than the others. I'd argue maybe that order of magnitude as well more effective, but we will talk about that more probably in the next video. Another topic is the additional benefits, which tips the scale in exactly the opposite direction. So it is obviously fantastic to preserve a forest in its existing form. A forest that has not been touched actually has the strongest carbon sequestration and ecosystem benefits. It's great to just leave the forest as is and do not do anything with it. It's great for nature and the communities around it. Planting new forests, so nature-based removal, also has benefits, as does planting mangroves or regenerative agriculture, etc. Benefits around employment and improved ecosystem it creates. So in general, most nature-based projects will have a ton of impact on the other SDGs as well, apart from number 13, which is on climate action. With tech-based projects, however, tech-based avoidance projects, they will likewise have a lot of benefits, but tech-based removal is almost irrelevant because it's just a big machine that you build and put somewhere. Right now they're being built in Iceland. Just finally, where they are. So unsurprisingly, the nature-based assets, carbon credit producing assets, tend to be where there are forests and mangroves, etc., which tends to be in the tropics. And tech-based removal tends to be in the US and Switzerland. So that also will be a factor when we consider some of the incentives on how this market might develop in the future. But that's it for today. Tune in next Sunday for my thoughts on the role of carbon credits in the fight against climate change, as well as my thoughts on the future development of this space. So thank you very much. Again, as last time, if you have any comments, I'm quite new to making YouTube videos, at least in this form. So if you have any comments and constructive criticism, please do let me know in the comments or feel free to direct message me. Thank you and goodbye.